Have you ever reached a moment in your life where you didn't want to die, but you also didn't want to exist the way you once did? Not because life defeated you, but because illusion fell away. There comes a strange, unsettling phase after deep awakening, a moment when the familiar self collapses, when old identities lose meaning, when ambition feels hollow, and the world appears strangely unreal. In this space, many people experience a quiet, terrifying thought: if this is all false, then why continue at all? This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is the soul standing naked before truth. Tonight, we explore why the desire not to exist often follows awakening, and why this moment, though painful, is not the end, but a profound beginning. When awakening occurs, it is rarely gentle. It does not arrive like a comforting insight or a soft revelation. It comes more like an inner earthquake, quiet on the outside, but devastating within. The structures that once gave you coherence begin to fracture. The ego, that carefully assembled psychological framework that told you who you were, what mattered, what to chase, and what to fear, starts to lose its authority. The stories you lived by no longer convince you. The roles you inhabited for years, achiever, victim, rebel, pleaser, hero, suddenly feel hollow, almost theatrical, as if you had been performing a part without realizing it. And when the performance stops, there is an unsettling silence. In that silence, something terrifying emerges. Not pain at first, not despair, but emptiness. A vast inner void where certainty once lived. The mind, which has been trained since childhood to define itself through labels and narratives, panics in the face of this absence. Psychologically, identity is not just a concept, it is a survival mechanism. It organizes experience, provides continuity, and gives the nervous system a sense of stability. When that identity dissolves, the body reacts as though its very existence is under threat. This is why those passing through deep inner transformation often experience anxiety, fatigue, numbness, or a depression that feels different from ordinary sadness. It is not grief for something lost in the outer world, but for a self that no longer exists. Consider the individual who has spent decades climbing a corporate ladder. Their days were structured by goals, deadlines, recognition, and status. Success was not merely something they achieved, it was who they were. Then one day, perhaps through burnout, loss, or a sudden insight, the illusion cracks. They realize that the titles, the praise, the constant striving no longer satisfy them. What once fueled their sense of worth now feels strangely meaningless. In that moment, a haunting question arises. If success doesn't define me, then who am I? This question is not philosophical curiosity. It is an existential tremor. The old identity has died, but nothing has yet taken its place. The same occurs in the inner life of the spiritual seeker. After years of introspection, meditation, or self-inquiry, they begin to see that thoughts are not the self, emotions are not the self, and even personality is something conditioned and impermanent. This realization can be liberating, but it can also be destabilizing. When the seeker asks, "If I am not my thoughts, then what remains?" they are standing at the edge of the unknown. The ego, stripped of its familiar reference points, cannot answer, and so it experiences emptiness not as freedom, but as annihilation. The desire not to exist often arises here, not because life is unbearable, but because the psyche is suspended between what has died and what has not yet been born. Meaning has collapsed, but a deeper meaning has not yet emerged. The mind interprets this gap as something gone wrong. Yet this state is not a disorder to be cured, it is a transition to be endured. In nature, winter is not a failure of life, but a phase of withdrawal, conservation, and unseen preparation. Seeds lie buried beneath frozen soil, appearing lifeless, while transformation occurs invisibly. In the same way, the inner void following ego dissolution is a psychological winter. Modern psychology increasingly recognizes that identity disruption can trigger what is called an existential crisis, a period marked by loss of meaning, questioning of values, and feelings of emptiness. But such crises are not inherently pathological. They are signals that the old framework of the self can no longer contain the individual's expanding awareness. The problem arises when one mistakes this emptiness for a final state rather than a passage. The psyche, desperate for relief, may fantasize about non-existence as the ultimate escape from tension. But this desire is not truly for death. It is for rest, for stillness, for an end to inner conflict. What makes this phase especially difficult is that society offers little language for it. From the outside, a person in psychological winter may appear unmotivated, lost, or broken. From the inside, they feel as though they have seen something they cannot unsee. The old ambitions feel dishonest. The old fears feel transparent. Yet, without a new center, the individual floats in uncertainty. This is why many feel isolated during this stage. They cannot easily explain what they are going through, and those around them may not understand why someone who has everything feels so empty. But emptiness, in this context, is not a void of nothingness. It is a clearing, a space where false identifications have fallen away. The ego mourns because it has lost control, but the deeper psyche is preparing for reorganization. Something essential is being asked of the individual: to remain present without immediately filling the emptiness with a new mask, a new role, or a borrowed belief. This patience is painful, yet necessary. To rush out of this winter too quickly is to rebuild the self from fear rather than truth. The desire not to exist, then, is the cry of a psyche that has outgrown its former shape. It is the sound of an old self dissolving, not yet knowing what it will become. When understood in this light, the emptiness is no longer an enemy. It is a threshold, and standing at this threshold requires courage, not the courage to become someone new immediately, but the courage to remain with not knowing, trusting that life, even stripped of familiar meaning, is still quietly at work within. Once the veil lifts, the world no longer appears as it once did. The familiar structures that once felt clear and unquestionable begin to reveal their hidden scaffolding. You start to notice how much of human life is driven not by conscious choice, but by fear: fear of being insignificant, fear of being excluded, fear of not being enough. You see comparison operating everywhere, quietly shaping ambition and self-worth. You recognize unconscious patterns passed down through families, cultures, and generations, repeating themselves through people who believe they are freely choosing. And with this recognition comes a strange mixture of clarity and heaviness, as if the eyes of the psyche have opened. But the heart is not yet prepared for what they see. Things that once shimmered with meaning begin to lose their enchantment. Money, which promised safety, freedom, and identity, suddenly appears symbolic rather than sacred. You still understand its function, but the spell it once cast is broken. Status, once pursued with intensity, starts to feel faintly absurd. A collective agreement to value certain roles, titles, and images more than others. You notice how much energy is spent maintaining appearances, how many lives are organized around being seen rather than being true. Social masks, once worn unconsciously, now feel heavy and exhausting. You sense the strain of smiling when you do not feel it, of speaking in rehearsed phrases, of playing a role in conversations that no longer touch what feels real inside you. This heightened awareness often brings with it a deep fatigue. Existential psychology describes this as existential exhaustion or fatigue, a state in which the individual, having become highly self-aware, feels drained by the artificiality of daily life. Ordinary interactions begin to feel scripted. Repetitive routines feel hollow. Even entertainment can feel strangely empty, as if it distracts but does not nourish. The mind keeps asking questions that cannot be unasked. Why does everyone seem so invested in this? Why am I participating in a game I no longer believe in? These questions are not born of arrogance or superiority. They arise from dissonance. The outer world continues to operate by rules the inner world no longer accepts. At this stage, it is common to feel alienated. You may look around and feel as though you are standing among actors who do not realize they are on a stage. Conversations revolve around accumulation, image, and competition, while you feel drawn toward meaning, depth, and authenticity. This gap can be profoundly lonely. Many people in this phase describe a sense of being out of sync with the world, as though they are living at a different frequency. It becomes tempting to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. Emotional withdrawal happens when it feels pointless to express what others cannot hear. Social withdrawal follows when superficial interaction feels like a betrayal of one's inner truth. Physical withdrawal sometimes occurs as the individual seeks silence, solitude, or nature, hoping to recover a sense of reality. History shows that this phase is not unique to modern times. Monks retreated into monasteries, mystics withdrew into deserts and forests, philosophers isolated themselves to think deeply, and seekers across cultures stepped away from society in order to understand the soul. What they encountered was not merely silence, but the confrontation with illusion, the realization that much of what humans collectively chase is a substitute for meaning, not its source. Yet withdrawal, while sometimes necessary, carries a hidden danger. When awareness deepens faster than integration, the individual may begin to confuse disillusionment with rejection of life itself. This is where a subtle but critical mistake often occurs. Seeing through illusion does not mean life is empty. It means the old interpretations of life were incomplete. When money loses its magic, it does not mean survival or responsibility vanish. It means they no longer define worth. When status feels absurd, it does not mean contribution or excellence are meaningless. It means they are no longer pursued for ego validation. When social masks feel exhausting, it does not mean human connection is false. It means connection must now be rooted in authenticity rather than performance. Awakening can feel overwhelming because it removes the psychological cushions that once softened reality. Illusions, while limiting, also protect. They give comfort, certainty, and belonging. When they fall away, reality feels raw and unfiltered. The nervous system, no longer buffered by collective beliefs, experiences overload. This is why the awakened individual may feel fragile, overstimulated, or emotionally exposed. The world has not become harsher, but perception has become sharper. Yet the purpose of this awakening is not escape. It is not meant to detach you from existence, nor to turn you into a passive observer of life. Its deeper aim is liberation from unconscious participation. To see the illusion is to gain the freedom to engage consciously. Instead of being driven by fear, you are invited to act from understanding. Instead of chasing symbols of worth, you are invited to embody it. Instead of hiding behind masks, you are invited to relate from truth. The challenge is learning to live in the world without being owned by it. This requires patience and compassion, both for oneself and for others who still need their illusions. The awakened person is not called to stand above life, but to stand within it with open eyes. When this integration begins, the overwhelming weight of awareness gradually transforms into quiet strength. The world does not regain its old magic, but a deeper, more grounded meaning starts to emerge, one that does not depend on pretending, but on presence. There is a distinction here that must be made with great care, because misunderstanding it can deepen suffering rather than relieve it. The desire not to exist, when it arises in the aftermath of inner awakening, is rarely a wish for death in the literal sense. Most who experience it are not seeking an end to life, they are seeking an end to strain. What they feel is not a pull toward destruction, but a longing for peace so deep that it seems unreachable within the structures of ordinary existence. The psyche, overwhelmed and overextended, reaches for the most absolute image of rest it can conceive. And in moments of exhaustion, non-existence appears as silence. These individuals are tired in a way that sleep does not cure. They are exhausted from inner conflict, the constant tension between what they feel is true and what they are expected to be. They are exhausted from pretending, from presenting a version of themselves that once ensured acceptance, but now feels dishonest. They are exhausted from carrying identities that no longer fit, like garments grown too small for a body that has continued to develop. Each day requires effort not because life is difficult, but because living out of alignment demands continuous psychological compensation. Neuroscience offers insight into this experience. When a person's internal sense of self is in prolonged conflict with their external roles and behaviors, the brain remains in a state of chronic stress. The nervous system cannot settle. It is as if the mind is constantly bracing for impact, expending energy to hold together structures that no longer belong. Over time, this strain manifests as fatigue, emotional numbness, irritability, or a desire to withdraw from stimulation altogether. The brain seeks rest, not in distraction, but in release. And when no image of peaceful rest seems available within life as it is currently lived, the mind constructs the idea of not being at all. Yet beneath this imagined escape lies a far more precise message. The soul is not asking to vanish. It is asking to be heard. When one listens closely, the desire not to exist often translates into quieter, truer longings. I want silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence where the constant inner noise finally subsides. I want truth. Not abstract truth, but the lived truth of being who one actually is without distortion. I want alignment. The deep harmony that arises when inner values and outer life no longer contradict each other. This is why people passing through this phase are drawn toward solitude. Solitude offers relief from performance. In the absence of an audience, the psyche can relax. Many feel an instinctive pull toward nature, not as a romantic escape, but as a return to rhythms that do not demand explanation. In forests, mountains, oceans, or deserts, there is no pressure to be someone. Life simply is. Simplicity becomes attractive because complexity has been used to hide misalignment. Stillness becomes necessary because constant movement has served as avoidance. To an outside observer, this withdrawal may look like disengagement from life, but inwardly, something very different is occurring. The individual is not running away from existence. They are learning how to inhabit it honestly for the first time. When external noise diminishes, an inner voice becomes audible, a voice that has long been suppressed beneath obligation, expectation, and fear. This voice does not shout. It speaks quietly, and it speaks of direction rather than demand. The longing to disappear is often nothing more than the longing to stop resisting transformation. Resistance is exhausting. It requires the ego to defend its old shape against a truth that is already unfolding. Every time one forces themselves back into an identity that no longer fits, tension increases. Every time one silences an inner knowing to meet external expectations, the psyche fragments further. The fantasy of non-existence arises because it promises an end to this resistance. But resistance can end without life ending. When resistance loosens, energy returns. What felt like emptiness begins to reveal itself as space. What felt like exhaustion begins to soften into calm. This does not happen instantly, nor without discomfort. The psyche must learn a new way of being, one that does not rely on constant self-definition. There is fear in this learning, because the ego has long believed that survival depends on control. Yet beyond that fear lies a state of rest that is very much alive. The great misunderstanding is to believe that peace can only be found by stepping out of existence. In truth, peace emerges when one stops fighting their own becoming. The soul does not ask for annihilation, it asks for congruence. It asks that life be lived from the inside out rather than the outside in. When this request is honored, the desire to disappear gradually transforms into a desire to be present, present without distortion, without pretense, without inner war. In this sense, the exhaustion is meaningful. It is the signal that the old way of living has reached its limit. The psyche can no longer sustain a divided life. What appears as a wish for non-existence is, at its core, a profound affirmation of life, a life that is quieter, truer, and more deeply aligned with what one has become. Every ancient tradition, though separated by geography and language, understood a truth that modern consciousness often forgets: death is never the final movement of life, but a passage within it. Long before psychology named inner transformation, myths gave it form. The hero does not awaken into light immediately. First, they descend. They are swallowed by the night sea, lost in the forest, buried in the underworld. This descent is not punishment, it is necessity. Only what is broken down can be rebuilt in a truer form. The psyche follows the same law. Ego death is not an ending, it is a threshold. When the ego collapses, there is a temptation to remain there, suspended in negation. The old self has died, and for a time, that feels like liberation. The ambitions that once tormented you are gone. The fears that once ruled you have loosened their grip. There is relief in no longer needing to be someone. But if this state is mistaken for completion, development halts. One becomes identified with emptiness itself. The personality remains dismantled but unreformed, like a house stripped to its foundations and left exposed to the weather. This is why some people linger in detachment, confusing absence of ego with wisdom, withdrawal with depth. To stop at ego death is to remain in suspension. Life does not flow through suspension, it stagnates. The psyche, like nature, seeks movement. When the old structures dissolve, something new must emerge, not a return to former identities, but a reorganization around consciousness rather than compulsion. This is the movement through ego death rather than into it. It is here that rebirth occurs, not as a dramatic event, but as a gradual assumption of responsibility at a deeper level. This responsibility is not a return to social expectations or inherited roles. It is not about becoming productive in the old sense or reclaiming ambition as it once existed. Responsibility now means living deliberately. Where once you were driven by fear of rejection, you are now asked to relate without armor. Where once you sought approval to stabilize your sense of self, you are now asked to stand without it. Where blind ambition once pushed you forward, you are now invited to ask why you move at all. The central question quietly shifts from, who must I be to be accepted, to, how will I live now that I see clearly? Seeing clearly does not make life easier, it makes it more honest. You can no longer hide behind unconscious motivations. You recognize when you are acting from fear, when you are conforming out of habit, when you are shrinking to remain comfortable. This awareness can feel heavy at first because it removes excuses, but it also grants freedom. Action is no longer reactive. Choice becomes possible. You are no longer a puppet of conditioning, but a participant in your own unfolding. Those who move through this threshold often discover that expression becomes unavoidable. Something within them seeks form, not because they crave recognition, but because what has been integrated demands expression. This is why so many who undergo deep inner transformation become artists, healers, teachers, or leaders of a different kind. Their work is not an attempt to prove worth. It is a response to inner necessity. The artist creates because what they have seen cannot remain unspoken. The healer listens because they recognize suffering as familiar terrain. The teacher speaks because insight unshared feels incomplete. The leader acts not to dominate, but to serve something larger than themselves. In this stage, life no longer asks you to perform. Performance belongs to the ego, the need to be seen, applauded, validated. Conscious participation is something else entirely. It is the willingness to be present in action without being consumed by image. It is doing what is needed without inflating the self around it. There is humility here, but not smallness. There is confidence, but not arrogance. One acts not to become someone, but because action itself has become an expression of alignment. This is also where joy quietly returns, not the excitement of achievement or the thrill of approval, but a deeper satisfaction, the kind that comes from coherence between inner truth and outer life. Even difficulty takes on a different tone. Struggle is no longer interpreted as failure, but as feedback. Challenges are no longer personal attacks, but invitations to deepen consciousness. Life regains weight and texture, not because illusion has returned, but because meaning has been rebuilt from within. Ego death, then, is not a place to reside. It is a doorway. To cling to it is to cling to negation. To pass through it is to accept life again, but on new terms. The self that emerges is quieter, less certain yet more real. It does not shout its identity, it lives it. It does not demand significance, it embodies it. And in this way, the descent into darkness fulfills its purpose, not by erasing the individual, but by transforming how they stand in the world. What awaits beyond ego death is not the old self restored, nor a perfected version of it, but a conscious one, a self that knows its limits and its depth, a self that no longer mistakes unconscious survival for living. This is rebirth, not into illusion, but into responsibility, presence, and a life participated in fully, with open eyes. After awakening, the world appears stripped of its familiar scripts. The roles, titles, and accolades that once seemed essential no longer provide sustenance. Society has long told us that meaning is something to be discovered externally, through wealth, recognition, relationships, or achievements. But in the quiet aftermath of awakening, these sources begin to reveal their limitations. The applause of others, the accumulation of symbols, the repetition of cultural expectations, all of these, while once comforting, suddenly feel like hollow gestures. They cannot touch the deeper self, the part that has glimpsed what is essential and eternal within. Awakening is the realization that meaning cannot be found waiting somewhere outside you. It must be created consciously, intentionally, and from a place of inner truth. This creation of meaning begins with alignment. Alignment is a profound internal harmony between thought, feeling, and action. It is choosing honesty over comfort, even when the consequences are uncertain. It is choosing presence over distraction, even when the world clamors for attention elsewhere. It is choosing contribution over ego, even when personal gain tempts you to act otherwise. These choices are neither simple nor instantaneous, because they require a constant vigilance, a refusal to settle for the illusions that the mind once used to maintain stability. Yet in making these choices, the awakened individual begins to experience a life that resonates with the depth of their being, a life that feels neither forced nor hollow, but organically necessary. Research in positive psychology illuminates this process in ways that intersect beautifully with the lived experience of awakening. Studies have shown that people who construct meaning through acts of service, creativity, and authentic connection, who dedicate themselves to expression and contribution beyond self-interest, report significantly higher long-term fulfillment than those who pursue pleasure, power, or status. This finding confirms what the awakening psyche already intuits: meaning is not given. It is earned through engagement with life that is deliberate, conscious, and generative. The paradox of awakening is that the more one ceases to chase validation, the more one has to give that is real, substantial, and transformative. The ego, once starved for recognition, becomes irrelevant. What matters now is the living of truth, not the demonstration of it. There is a liberation in this realization. When the self no longer depends on external markers for identity, a new freedom emerges. You do not exist to cling to roles or achievements. You do not exist to uphold an image. You exist to give form to the truths that arise from within. This truth is not abstract. It takes shape in concrete actions, in relationships, in creation, and in care. A painter may express it through color and form, a teacher through clarity and guidance, a parent through presence and patience, a scientist through discovery that illuminates life. Each expression is an offering of the inner alignment that the individual has painstakingly cultivated. The creation of meaning is also intimately connected with responsibility. Once the veil of illusion lifts, it becomes impossible to live unconsciously. Choices cannot be made purely out of habit or compulsion. Every thought, word, and action carries the potential to affirm or betray this newly recognized inner truth. This responsibility is not burdensome, it is a privilege, the privilege of participating in life fully, without pretense. The awakened individual is no longer a passive passenger, swept along by circumstance or social expectation. They are an active co-creator of their own existence and of the influence they extend into the world. What makes this process profoundly human is that it is iterative and imperfect. Alignment is not a permanent state. It is continuously tested by challenges, distractions, and the pull of old patterns. Yet even failure within this process is instructive. Misalignment reveals the areas where attention, courage, and discernment are required. The awakened person learns to navigate life with humility, patience, and courage, recognizing that meaning is not a static possession, but a dynamic creation, one that grows richer as it is practiced. The paradox deepens when one observes how this form of meaning transforms relationships. When the individual ceases to exist for validation, they begin to interact with others not as mirrors of their own worth, but as independent beings with whom authentic connection is possible. Trust, generosity, and empathy flourish naturally. These connections are no longer transactional or contingent. They arise organically from the clarity and honesty that the awakened individual brings. This is why those who have passed through awakening often report a renewed sense of love, purpose, and interconnectedness, not imposed from without, but emerging from their own conscious alignment. Ultimately, the awakened life is a life of expression. The individual realizes that existence is not a problem to be solved, nor a pursuit to be measured by achievement, but an ongoing opportunity to manifest truth in form. Each action, each choice, each moment of presence becomes a brushstroke on the canvas of life. Meaning is no longer something to be sought externally, no longer a question to be answered by society, but a reality to be lived, moment by moment. Through conscious creation, alignment, and authentic expression, the awakened individual discovers a life that is neither accidental nor imposed, but profoundly, ineffably their own. This understanding transforms the very way one experiences the world. Life is no longer a series of obligations or performances. It is an unfolding dialogue between inner truth and outer reality, a co-creation in which every decision, every act of attention, every moment of presence contributes to the ongoing formation of meaning. In this way, awakening does not remove struggle or challenge, but it imbues them with significance, transforming every difficulty into an opportunity for growth, clarity, and expression. Through this process, the individual comes to see that meaning is never found, never gifted by circumstance or society. It is created, moment by moment, through courage, awareness, and the deliberate shaping of life itself. If you have felt the desire not to exist after awakening, hear this clearly: nothing is wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are standing between who you were and who you must become. Do not confuse the death of illusion with the death of life. Let the false self die, but let the deeper self live fully, because the world does not need more unconscious people chasing meaning. It needs those who have seen the emptiness and chose to fill it with purpose. And perhaps your continued existence is not a burden, but a responsibility.